Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I want to talk about cultures in fantasy. This is a topic that has been on my mind for a long time already, and it's also a topic that particularly interests me because I have mentioned a lot of times already on this channel. I do study cultural and social anthropology. I'm currently finishing my bachelor's, and in autumn I'm probably going to start with my master's degree. As such, cultures generally, and also specifically the depiction of cultures, is something that interests me. Before I start talking about cultures in fantasy, let me get a few things out of the way. First of all, this might be 2 videos, I do not know yet. I have a few things that I want to talk about and I do not want to cut myself short, so I might talk for over an hour right now, and if that's the case, then I will split this video into 2 parts. You probably know already by the title if there's a little part 1 at the end of the title or not, but I currently do not know. And then the second thing I have is that there's 3 big topics that I want to talk about. The first of those topics is just the existence of cultures in fantasy in general. When do we have different cultures in fantasy? When do we need different cultures in fantasy? How can we add different cultures to fantasy? And so on. This is also, if I split it into 2 parts, I will probably only have this part in this video right now. Then, as the second topic, I want to talk a little bit about the portrayal of different cultures in fantasy. So along the lines of coding, stereotyping, do's and don'ts, like when is it sometimes maybe even necessary to stereotype to a certain degree, and so on. And then the third thing I want to talk about is also portrayal of cultures by authors of different ethnicities and how it might play into the story, what you can portray, what you should portray, what you should be careful of, cultural appropriation, that whole thing, because I do think that is something that has become quite important to talk about when we talk about cultures and their portrayal in fantasy. But yeah, that was a really long intro, so now let me get right into it, and you're probably going to hear a lot of noise in the background again because they're still building stuff and they're using like this, I don't know what you call it, like the pressure hammer thingy, and it's really loud. Anyway, cultures in fantasy, the existence of cultures in fantasy. Before I get into that, there's again 2 things that I want to say. The first thing I want to say is that hypothetically I'm just talking about the stories. For this first thing, I am completely ignoring what ethnicity the author might be, and I'm just going to assume that the cultures that are portrayed in the fantasy aren't stereotyped, aren't negative stereotypes, and so on, because I want to talk about that later on again, as I said. Then the second thing that I also want to talk about a little bit is race. And I personally do not like using the word race. As you might have noticed in my videos, I try as often as possible to use the word ethnicity. Part of that is because the German word for race, Rasse, is not used for people, for humans. You do not use Rasse for human. First of all, the reason for that is in connection with Nazi Germany, which of course Rasse, race politics, was used to make one race seem worth more than other races, but also it's simply wrong. There is no races in humans, and it's all politics and propaganda, so yeah, that's why I do not like using the word race for humans. However, that being said, I will use the word race instead of ethnicity in this video. The reason for that being that I do want to look at kind of culture and ethnicity or race in a very separate way. Even when you look at our world, at Earth, you, for example, have tons of black people who technically are seen as belonging to the same race. However, the culture of African Americans are completely different than the culture of a lot of Africans. And even within Africa, you have a plethora of different cultures, even though the people, like, of course there's minor differences, but they're technically the same within Europe you have a lot of different cultures, even though a lot of people don't see it like that, but we are all white. We technically all belong to the same race. And so that's one part of the reason why I'm going to use race in this video. The other reason is that while I usually try to use ethnicity instead of race, I do not think that in the way I want to talk about it in this video, which is just like the purely physical representation of a person or of a race in fantasy, I don't think that ethnicity quite captures that meaning, because ethnicity as a term very much is interwoven with the term culture and with the cultural heritage of a person. So yeah, that's a very long explanation as to why I'm going to use race and culture. When I talk about culture, I am very much only talking about the social aspects of culture. So let's say religion, let's say gender, let's say the clothing, the food, all that stuff. And when I'm talking about race and about the depiction of race in fantasy, I very much only mean the physical representation of a person in fantasy. So do you have people in fantasy that have a darker skin tone? Do you have people in fantasy that kind of are similar to East Asian people in the way they look and that type of stuff? So now that we have this very long intro after the intro out of the way, let's actually start talking about cultures in fantasy. The first thing I want to have out of the way is to acknowledge that it's a different thing if you have a setting that's like the Stormlight Archive series, which is a 10-book epic fantasy series that is set on an entire planet, compared to having a standalone like Elantris. I know it's not going to be a standalone forever, but a standalone like Elantris that is basically set within one country. In this story, you will first of all have the space to describe way more cultures, but it also will seem very strange if you then have an entire planet and there's only one culture, basically, maybe like different offshoots from that one culture, but it's still like pretty similar. That's going to be like unrealistic, let's be honest. And it's way more likely that maybe you have just one culture, or you describe just one culture in a story where it's set in only one country. And maybe you will have like single people that your main characters meet that don't belong to that culture, but you probably won't spend the time to like describe in every single detail what those other cultures are about. Similarly, also in terms of race, you will have a lot more differently looking people in an epic high fantasy series compared to a fantasy series that is set just in a single country. However, now we come to a point where kind of there's a lot of discussion around it, and that is historical accuracy in fantasy. First of all, let me just say that to a certain degree, it's fantasy. You can do whatever you want. I mean, I do agree that there's limits to that kind of, but I don't agree with the limits that like the white dude bros on r/fantasy have or whatever. That it was like this in medieval Europe and your story is based on medieval Europe and so your story has to be patriarchal and white, dude. That's just not the case. First of all, often that history that those fantasy books are based on wasn't even actually like that, because you know there's such a thing as bias in history and bias in writing history, and history like historically was written mostly by white men, so maybe we just know of the stories of white men and we often don't really know the stories of the women at that time. We don't know how much of a role they actually played, or we don't know like how diverse the like demographic at the time actually was. So that's the first thing when it comes to historical accuracy with fantasy. Also that it's just silly to have historical accuracy in fantasy. I do agree that it's very nice to look at, to like have something to model your world after. But we then change those worlds to accommodate dragons, to accommodate elves, and I don't get why we can't also do that with different cultures and races. So let's start with the assumption, okay, European history was actually white. You can then go and set your fantasy in a merchant city, in a harbor. somewhere where there even historically were a lot of people that moved in and out of that place. So you will automatically have a lot of different faces already. Also, I kind of get that, like, if you just have a more smaller scale fantasy and it's set in a single country, you might just want one culture. You might not want to have the work of thinking of different cultures. However, that doesn't mean that all the people in that country have to be the same race. For example, let's say you don't even have to write about it, to be honest. You can just have that in your mind, and if people ask you, say, yeah, that's because it is. Like, historically, even in our world, there were huge waves of migration. Who's to say that sometime in, like, way back in your world, there wasn't a migration of people from somewhere entirely different in your world that came to that country, and now because of that, there's different people in that country. Makes sense, doesn't it? So that's just how you can get different races into your country. Then you can get different cultures into your country as well. First of all, again, harbors, merchant cities will have people from different cultures, not just different races. But also, if you have, let's say, two different races in your country because of this migration period, you can say that, for example, okay, it's long enough back that those two people kind of assimilated to each other, yet there are still distinct elements that are different between the two races. Not so different that you have to, like, write an entirely new culture, but just different enough that you can make them distinct from each other. Now, I'm talking about cultures a lot in this video, obviously, duh. But something that I have not mentioned so far is that, to be honest, cultures is usually the part of world building that I like the least in a story. And the thing that, if it's done well, I enjoy the most. For example, where is it? Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time. Overall, so far, I'm 7 books into this series. I would give this series probably a 3 stars. I, like, enjoy it well enough, but it's like whatever a little bit. However, every single time the Aiel, I think they're called, I think that's how you pronounce it at least, come onto the scene, I freak out. Because I have never read a culture that is so well done. And the thing where I think, aside from the general portrayal of the Aiel, which I'll talk more if I talk about portrayal of cultures, actually the thing that I want to talk about now probably also belongs to that, but I want to talk about it here, so deal with it. Anyway, the thing that I love most about the Aiel, and that I think makes it such a great thing, is that Robert Jordan understood that it's not necessarily about the, like, simple things in cultures that we think about, like, is it patriarchal, is it matriarchal, what is the religion, what are the clothes. You can have all of that, you can add that to your story, but the more important thing is almost the interactions between the people, because your culture will change your outlook on life and also your philosophy. And what your philosophy is will change how you interact with other people, also how you interact with other people from other countries. And I think for some reason authors just never concentrate on that and, like, never do that. You mostly either have antagonistic cultures that then are just, like, dragged through the mud pretty much, and you will give those cultures just, like, things that we now in our Western society don't like, and that's how you then start disliking the culture. But it's just, like, really interesting thing, because you can have so many interesting character moments in, like, just showing how people from different cultures interact. So to kind of show what I mean, how much the interaction between people of different cultures can add to a story, and why please just have different people from different cultures in your story, I have 2 books. The first is actually a sci-fi, but it's same principle, counts as well. It's The Dying of the Light by George R.R. Martin. Overall, I did not really enjoy this book. However, the part that I really enjoyed is where the main character kind of got in contact with this very depicted primitive, brutal culture, which I did not like. And there were multiple like talks with people from that culture where he kind of realized how judgmental he is and so on. And I did really, really enjoy that. Like, comparison between cultures can lead to great character moments. And then the other book I have is The Killing Moon by N.K. Jemisin, which is the first book in the Dream Blood duology. Here the main characters belong to two different countries, not even necessarily cultures. They're kind of similar, but not really. They belong to the same religion, however it's kind of like in Christianity you have like the kind of, I don't know, Mormons, and then you have the Catholics, and then you have the Protestants, and so on. So it's the same religion, but there's some differences between them, which can then lead to a lot of conflict. And that's part of what's kind of also explored in this book, which another great way to use culture, where you don't even need to create two completely different cultures. You can just change them in some simple key aspects, which then lead to conflict and which can then center the plot of the story. But I think that's long enough for this video for now, and those are the simple things that I wanted to talk about just when it comes to creating cultures in your story. First of all, of course, epic fantasies have bigger scales. It's easier to put different cultures into your stories and also different races into your stories. Second thing, if you have a smaller scale, you can easily have part of your setting or your whole setting be in a merchant city, in a harbor, and then you can just naturally have more people that go in and out of that city. But even if you, let's say, have a country setting where it's be more likely that like just, you know, the people living there are more homogeneous, you can have something happen in the history of your country that means that there's a lot of different races that live in that country now, even though their cultures are very similar. And then also, if you have cultures, don't just concentrate on the simply cosmetic things, because that's kind of what it comes down to a lot of times, without really changing the characters and the way the characters act that come from the different culture, and just use the way cultures change our philosophies and our actions to just create conflict, create character conflict, create possibilities for characters to grow. So these were the things that I wanted to talk about in this video, and I think I covered them pretty well. And then also, of course, just as a general thing, we don't need all fantasy to be like white culture or stereotypical white culture history centered, because it's fantasy. You can do whatever you want, but I think I'm going to talk more about the questions behind like which cultures we portray how and so on in the next video, because it's definitely going to be 2 videos now. And with that said, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Leave me your thoughts on the topic of cultures in fantasy in the description box down below. I'm going to be very interested in definitely going through the comment section of this video. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. Also, all the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, in which we read 1 adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, will also be in the description box down below, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!